Helen, are you ready to speak?
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a crisis here at my house, but anyway, we're okay. We're
You're
okay.
all
Yes.
right.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a member of Reclaim the NHS. I'm not a retired campaigner. I'm retired from work,
Yeah,
but I'm still campaigning. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm a member of Reclaim NHS, but I am speaking personally here today. And I just wanted to make four basic points. They're rather long points, so I hope I don't go over the 20 minutes. But
you're fine. Whatever
anyway,
you take.
I'll see how it goes. Tell me to shut up. So my point number one. There's a tendency to make out that privatisation is just one of the elements creating a perfect storm for the NHS, along with underfunding and reorganisations and staff shortages. I firmly believe that privatisation is the driving force behind all of these other things, underfunding, etc. It's designed to degrade and disparage a socialised health system and push people into private insurance and justify the extended use of private companies. I think if you look at this historically, you can see it very, very clearly. Since 1945, all aspects of a socialised economy, public ownership in particular, have been in the firing line from the proponents of free enterprise and the market system. And the NHS, in a way, is just part of it, although it's the one that they're the most careful about dealing with and privatising. Gradually, in the course of the 1950s and 60s, there was a big counterattack mounted, for instance, by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a British offshoot of a worldwide organisation founded by Friedrich Hayek, who was Margaret Thatcher's favourite economist. Now, the IEA and other similar think tanks attracted academics who argued a series of things which were geared towards privatisation. First of all, they argued that the socialised system that emerged after 1945 didn't have better outcomes than the pre-war system of the voluntary system of hospitals and GP practices. They argued that the nationalised industries generally were inefficient, needed to operate on non-commercial lines. That is, the private sector always and everywhere does things better. They argued in a very broad sense that state spending itself in its very nature, it crowded out private investment. So we need to shrink the state. And in the 1960s, the IEA was clearly discussing, quote, a shift in the health from public to private or partly private finance. They were discussing the use of personal vouchers through which people could buy education or health. So the search for ways to increase private involvement, it wasn't just ideological, as all that seems to indicate. It also sprang from what was going on in the economy. The 1970s had seen a profit squeeze, and companies were on the lookout for more profitable forms of investment. And at the same time, there's evidence that by the 1990s, the health insurance market in the United States was saturated. So all those companies were also looking for future ways to expand. And so the public sector, and in particular the NHS, what was it? It was a constant form of income stream provided by taxpayers. And if you could siphon off lots of that into the private sector, well, that was the way of increasing profitability. So what we had was 4 decades of softening up the government, of softening up people against privatisation. And I think by the 1980s, the plans were still vague, but they all put privatisation centre stage. And you only have to read the writings of people like Oliver Letwin and John Redwood to see the whole point of their attack on the NHS, what they called Britain's biggest enterprise. The whole purpose of their attack was to get privatisation in, but you had to do it by stealth. So instead, all the reforms were dressed up as modernising or providing patient choice, but it was all about privatisation. And I think the point to make here is that, as well, the NHS had always used the private sector. In fact, the private sector did very well out of the NHS because the NHS needed buildings constructed. It needed to buy all sorts of equipment. It needed pharmaceuticals. It needed scientific instruments. It even needed things like beds and bedpans and sheets. All these things were provided by the private sector. All these goods. What privatisation they were talking about, and what we mainly talk about today as well, is the privatisation of services, clinical services, ancillary services of catering and cleaning. That's what they want to get privatised. And they also mean things like joint ventures, like the PFIs, And that brings in the private sector through borrowing from the banks rather than from the government. And you do so at about double the cost. That's my first point. Privatisation is absolutely central. Don't get misled by these ideas that it's just one of many. It's a key driver. And my second point is that you mustn't underestimate the extent of the scale of privatisation, because again, we've got deception going on here. One of the reasons that people are able to argue that privatisation is just one part of the problem is because they point to government figures, which seem to show that just 7 to 8% of NHS spending goes to private providers. But a more recent analysis has shown that, in fact, up to 26% of the National Health Service England spend is on all non-NHS providers. Now, it's probably could be rather more than that. I don't know, but it could be, because it's not clear that PFIs are included. And through PFI, everything goes to the private sector, either in debt repayments or through the services that are paid for, such as maintenance and cleaning and laundry, which are usually provided as part of PFI contracts. It doesn't include all the other things that the Department of Health spends money on. It doesn't include the huge IT systems that they've invested in, the investment in the new organisation schemes. Implementing privatisation involves all sorts of administrative expenses, the tendering for contracts, monitoring contracts, legal wrangles, employing consultancies. Marketisation has cost the NHS administrative costs of the NHS increased between the 1990s and 2012 from 6% to 15% per year, and are possibly still higher by now. And this means a very sizable proportion of NHS spending goes directly not to the patients, but into dividends and into tax havens. Just a very small local example of what's happening, and this is the PFI example. In Queen Elizabeth Hospital, there's a PFI. The company which holds the PFI contracts is called Meridian Hospital Company Holdings Limited, and it's jointly owned by two companies you'll have never heard of, Fenton UK3 and Innisfree. Well, Meridian paid out to those two companies £3 million in 2022 in interim dividends, plus £7 million to the people who provide the debt, the banks, the bondholders, whoever they may be right now, and we don't necessarily know. £10 million in 1 year from one hospital. And this is replicated across the country. It might seem small beer, but all these things add up. And that doesn't include the fact that a lot of PFI contracts include giving contracts out to companies like ISS Mediclean, which operates at QEH, and they themselves must take their cut, must take their profits as well as which, of course, at the same time, we know that wages are reduced and services are worse. So that's the second point I want to make. It's huge. The level of privatisation is very big. Don't believe the government, because there's lies, damned lies, and statistics. And point number 3 I want to make is, how did we get here? How do we understand how we got to this situation? And my thing is here, we've got a uni-party, just like they talk about in the United States with the Democrats and the Republicans. We've got a uni-party. It's not just the Tories who are the problem. Over the whole post-war period, there's been a continuity of policies between the two main parties. It's a sort of children's entertainment, if you like, to me, to you, to me, to you. And it goes like that. The Conservatives did not try to undermine the NHS in the 1950s, and the Labour government of 1997 continued, and I would say intensified, the process of privatisation. They kept on with the stealth. Many of the reforms didn't actually require legislation. They were secured through changes to rules and conditions of service. It was all quite, only the people in the know really understood what was going on. How many of us knew about the Concordat that Alan Milburn came to with the Independent Healthcare Association? And that organisation was led by a man called Tim Evans, who looked forward to a time, to quote, when the NHS would be a kite mark attached to the institutions and activities of a system of purely private providers. And if we look at what was actually happening, I can't talk about all the things that were carried on, but just two policies that were carried on. One of the main things that the Conservative governments from Thatcher and Major did was to create an internal market. And that is, they created what's called the purchaser-provider split. And under Major, most NHS bodies were made into trusts who sold their services to the purchasers, who were another creation of the Tories, the primary care trusts. And all that has since evolved into the main commissioning bodies, the purchasers, being the clinical commission groups and now the integrated care boards. In addition to that, Labour carried on with that, but it also turned the trusts into so-called foundation trusts. And that made the trusts financially independent, free to operate like a private business, allowed to use their assets for private patients, but also, of course, the freedom to go bust. Every decision had to be judged from the standpoint of financial viability. And it was clothed as an exercise in local autonomy and community involvement, but actually it ushered in a process of competitive tendering, competition between hospitals for business, rather than the collaboration that's needed for healthcare. And again, to give another local example, nearby Oxley's Foundation Trust, they have the contract from the Belmarsh group of prisons to provide health services there. But they use that contract with Belmarsh to promote their services, and they win contracts in Kent and for Kent and Medway prisons, which might otherwise go to the local hospitals. It might well be more rational for them to go to the local hospitals, but no, Oxley's wins the contract, and I think they've also bid for contracts within the London boroughs, for London prisons. And the second major thing they carried on, of course, and embraced with gusto, was PFI, and I won't talk any more about that. But in addition, the Labour government set in train processes which were then further developed after 2010. Just mention a couple. It was under Labour that the idea of integrated care started to be developed. Integrated care is using systems other than hospitals to treat especially long-term care. And it means you don't need to place so much reliance on expensive hospital care. They're going to be managed in the community, but they don't use the term in the community because that resonates with Thatcher's terrible experiment with closing mental health hospitals and having mental health patients looked after in the community. And there was a major 2006 memo from within the NHS calling for a restructuring of the NHS infrastructure to allow for this process to happen. Under Labour, the most expensive civilian IT programme ever was attempted. It was called Communicating for Health. It did not succeed. There was a few patchy bits set up, but it cost the taxpayer £11 billion. It was supposed to be a way of digitising and allowing doctors to access patient records across the country. It didn't succeed in its full extent, but it allowed private contractors to basically crawl all over NHS systems, know exactly how NHS systems work. I think to an extent we can thank that process for the now burgeoning interest among software IT providers, their interest in the use of patient data. And finally, they co-opted the unions through the Social Partnership Forum, which is established by Patricia Hewitt. And the remit of that requires levels of confidentiality in certain matters. And it basically is trying to get staff through the unions to participate in the changes. But the changes, or the reforms as they call them, are all about privatisation. What the Labour government did that was different was that it brought in a huge increase in NHS spending, an increase of 30% in real terms. Now, that led to some definite improvements, particularly with waiting lists. But one has to say, a part of that paid for a huge increase in the salaries of doctors, with a view, a lot of people would argue, to buying them off as they signed the new NHS plan. But another part also will have been paying for the increased costs of market testing. And I think we need to be very wary of all additional funds provided to the NHS, because sometimes they appear to me to be bailing out often PFI providers or other private providers. Overall, I think it's not surprising. There was a man who was an advisor to Blair and quite a noted sort of NHS academic, a man called Julian Legrand. And he said that he saw the Health and Social Care Act brought in by the Tories as the completion of the work of the preceding Labour government that constituted, quote, a sensible evolution of previous strategies, while also advancing choice and competition. Why, with that record, would anyone think that voting in a Labour government would be good for the NHS? And they seem to do so in spite of the way that Kidstarver and Wes Streeting are sort of rolling back on any of the promises they said they were originally in favour of. And I'm going to go on to something really controversial here. You see, I think one reason why people stick to Labour, for the NHS purposes at least, is because it's old Labour. It's a Labour that introduced the NHS. I think there's a problem with that historical view. I wouldn't downplay for a minute the crucial role of Aneurin Bevan in pushing through the NHS. But the policies that were pushed through were essentially those developed under the wartime coalition of Labour, Liberal and Conservative. And no government in 1945 could afford to say openly or in any other way that they were going to roll back the progress that had been made during the war through the emergency medical services, through the free health services provided to the victims of bombing, evacuees, and of course the soldiers. I want to move on to my point number 4. And my final point is that, in my experience, if one is convinced of the need to get the Tories out, particularly if it's as a result of any policies they may or may not have on the NHS, it can lead to a distorting effect on campaigns. It leads to a downplaying of the message so as not to rock the boat. And I think it leads to an undue belief in the power of lobbying, and the power of lobbying, particularly Labour MPs and councillors, rather than the focus on broadening and deepening campaigning among the mass of ordinary people. And I think nowhere was that better illustrated in Lewisham. Have I got time, Dave?
Yes, you've got
okay.
as time as you need, ma'am.
Okay, one of the very last acts of the Labour government was the introduction of the Trust Special Administrator. Now, he was basically somebody who, like any accountant, when a business goes bankrupt, it'll go into administration. And one of the first duties of any accountants who are called in is to sort out the order in which creditors are to be paid from this bankrupted entity. Only this system that was set up by the Labour government was to deal with an NHS organisation, the trusts, the hospital trusts. And the first use of this process was the South London Healthcare Trust, which ran 3 hospitals, the QEH, the Prue and Queen Mary's in Sidcup. Now, the trust had run into effective bankruptcy, principally as the TSA, the Trust Special Administrators, the TSA's report made very clear, as a result of 2 very large. So the Trust Special Administrator, the basic problem was PFI, and the solution was to run down 2 hospitals, Queen Mary and Lewisham, which did not have PFIs. Lewisham wasn't even in the South London Healthcare Trust, but they were solvent, and they were to be combined with these hospitals that were indebted. So the Queen Mary was transferred to Oxley's, the Prue was transferred to the King's College, came under the King's College, and Lewisham and QEH were combined in a new trust, the Lewisham and Greenwich Trust. But the point is, the whole problem, the crux of the problem, was PFI, and the Labour Party had its fingerprints all over both of them. Now, I was at the founding of the KOMP in Lewisham in about 2011, and that was the main organisation which then went on to form the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. And I both was part of proposing, and I took on a lot of the administrative tasks of organising the 2 big demos. What I saw in the course of that campaign was that members of the Labour Party, close sympathisers with the Labour Party, wanted, admittedly the right wing of the Labour Party, I don't associate this with everybody, but it was at the heart, they wanted PFI, which was at the heart of the campaign, downplayed. We were told that PFI was just part of the problem. There was a perfect storm coming at us from Tory policies. Therefore, we needed to get the Tories out. That it wasn't PFI that was bad. It was just the QEH PFI that was so bad. And I saw the process by which this grouping would get PFI removed from placards. And instead, the slogan became all about saving Lewisham Hospital. People in the Greenwich campaign tried to point out that the Trust Special Administrator's proposals threaten not just Lewisham Hospital, but also Queen Mary, and we should be opposing the whole thing. The case for the judicial review was prepared through a small, self-selected grouping within the campaign, and they did not challenge the TSA report as a whole. It was all about saving Lewisham Hospital. Queen Mary got left completely out of their concern. That whole campaign ignored the demise of Queen Mary's. But more than that, I would say the real problem was that the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign was of national significance. It chimed with feelings against PFI up and down the country, and hospitals in many parts could see bankruptcy down the line as a result of their PFIs. We needed to make drawing with other campaigns and spearhead a national movement. But a broader movement against PFI would not be a good look for the Labour Party. And I think that explains a large part of the narrow focus of the campaign. It became, in effect, to me, almost a form of NIMBYism. And it really aided the careers of certain Labour politicians, such as Heidi Alexander. So there's quite a lot of bitterness connected with the final outcomes. Although we saved Lewisham Hospital, great outcome, but we didn't press on. We didn't press on in the way we could have and mobilised more and more people against PFI and by extension against the privatisation of the NHS. So I hope I haven't been too long. I just wanted to summarise, if I may, the points I've been making. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine.
I've got to share my screen, haven't I? Hang on. I've got to share my screen somehow. Hang on. There we are. Sorry. Is that right? And then am I on share screen?
Yeah, you're on shared screen.
Is that right? Does that work?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I have to minimize that. So I've got 4 points. Privatisation is a driving force. It's very, very extensive. We've got a uni-party operating here, and get the full message across. Don't be diverted in campaigning strategy by the focus on electing a Labour government. Vote Labour if you want to. I'm not telling people how to vote, but don't let it affect the strategy of what we're doing. And in answer to the question of sorry, I'm just going to go back a bit. I can't do it. In answer to who can we trust with our NHS, my answer is Cuba. I think they've got a fully socialised health service there. And the reason why I'm raising it is because when Castro was looking around.
Nicholas, can you put yourself on mute, please? Thank you.
When Castro was looking around for models for setting up the Cuban system, one of the things they adopted was our system of family practitioners. And it's an amazing system. I mean, probably a lot of you know about it, but one GP for every 1,000 doctors, and each GP practice, one GP for every 1,000 patients, each GP practice with a dedicated public health outreach person and a dedicated practice nurse. And then finally, just to round it off, I've got some reading, because if you want to get a full sense of the extent of privatisation, one of the really great websites to go to is this one here, NHS for Sale. It goes through sector by sector, company by company. It's very, very detailed and very, very comprehensive. It's really worthwhile. And of course, every doctor has its privatisation map, and we can drill down from that to see what's going on inside our particular locality. So I'll stop screen sharing. But thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope, sorry, back to meeting. Sorry, what am I doing? I can't seem to get back. Stop. That's it. Done it. Okay.
Okay. That was superb, Helen. Thank you very much.